White supremacy is a massive issue in Canada. It is not just an American thing. It is not just a European thing. It is something that we develop, nurture, and grow here in Canada. Groups like this, they go out of their way to anytime there's a crime that is committed by a racialized person or by an immigrant, they will blow it up and make it their sort of pet cause for an extended period of time to suggest that these people are dangerous. They've also made really threatening remarks. He said, if he saw me getting gang by Indian migrants in the streets, he would just laugh and say nature's playground.
In 2019, Canada was named through a poll as the most accepting country for immigrants. And I think it's safe to say that that's no longer the case.
You know what also isn't pleasant is having to live in a world where there's white supremacists advocating for the mass deportation of people who don't look like me.
With so much attention on the surge of far-right rhetoric in the United States and the rise of far-right politics across Europe, there's one country that's often missing from the conversation: Canada. But in the years since what's been called the Freedom Convoy of 2022, reporting from Canada has pointed to a growing ecosystem of far-right and white nationalist groups inside the country, including the spread of so-called active clubs, groups of white nationalist men who basically operate fight clubs or fitness focus clubs in anticipation of violence. The Canadian Anti-Hate Network, an NGO, now says the white nationalist movement in Canada has never been larger or more dangerous. I'm about to get into all of that with Rachel Gilmore, an independent journalist who has been reporting on the far right in Canada and who's had to deal with all sorts of threats and harassment online as a result of that work. My name is Mohamed Hashem, and this is Real Talk. And she joins us from Montreal, Rachel Gilmore. Thank you so much for coming on Real Talk.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm so excited to be here.
Me too. There's so much that we're going to get into, but I'm so happy that we kind of found the time to have this chat. You know, as I was prepping for this interview, Rachel, one thing I thought of asking you, you know, when you have conversations in Canada, when you're back home, you or me or whoever's listening, I feel like one of the things that the common phrases that people tell you over coffee is like, oh man, thank God we're not the US. You know, all this white nationalist stuff, all this far right stuff, that's south of the border. That's not us. How do you react when you hear that? I know how I react, but how do you react?
Yeah. I mean, first of all, I'm very jealous of the world that they live in where they think that doesn't exist in Canada. But yeah, and then I immediately destroy that world for them and tell them about the fact that we very much have our own white nationalism here. And in fact, a lot of the US white nationalism, I mean, we've exported some really awful guys down to the States. So, you know, I mean, if you look at the Proud Boys, the guy who started that group was Canadian. So, you know, it's very much a mutual exchange of awfulness between our two countries, and Canada very much has its own problem with white supremacy.
It's Gavin McInnes, if I'm not mistaken.
Yes. Yeah.
But okay, well, let's delve into it. You know, when it comes to issues relating to the far right in Canada, what's the landscape? What can you share about what's happening right now?
So the Canadian far right is really interesting, and it has some aspects that I think are kind of unique to Canada, not necessarily because of the country itself, but just the way that our far right has sort of coalesced here is I haven't seen anything like it. And the extremism researchers who I lean on heavily, who are much smarter than me, but hopefully I can do a good job of parroting what they've told me. But, you know, they've told me that they don't see this really happening in the same way elsewhere either. And it's that we have this group called Diagolon that has sort of subsumed, it's sort of, grown in this way where it adopts these other organizations that crop up. And it's sort of like we have this more centralized white nationalist movement in a way that other countries don't. They might have more infighting and more of these separate groups with big leaders and big personalities. Whereas here in Canada, we kind of have these guys that are really controlling things and really like they are the main white nationalist network in this country.
Well, actually, you know what? That's interesting. Let's talk about it because you mentioned Diagolon. There's also others as well. There's Second Sons. There's Dominion. But for Diagolon, I mean, I think at face value, when you do a bit of research, I guess the way they introduce, and correct me if I'm wrong, the way they introduce themselves or the way they carry themselves is more like, oh, we're comedians or we're some sort of meme creators, or it's something lighthearted, something that's not serious. Am I right?
Absolutely. Yeah. And actually, like, Diagolon, Second Sons, and the Dominion Society are all tied together. They're basically, especially Second Sons and Diagolon, are really one and the same. It's the same leaders. But I'll break that down in a second if you'd like me to. But in terms of Diagolon itself, they really came to prominence as a group of just live streamers. They would do these live streams where they would say some pretty egregious stuff, but they would later claim it's a joke. And particularly during the COVID-19 pandemic, they really hopped on that anti-science, anti-vaccine, anti-lockdown rhetoric and were involved with the Freedom Convoy, for example. And they sort of formed this, they play this sort of propaganda role in a big way where they claim to be joking, but the ideology underlying what they're joking about is very serious. If you listen to them for any extended period of time, they're very much accelerationists who have this sort of doom, pessimistic view of society that we're headed towards collapse. So they want to hasten it. They have some members who are very much like white nationalists. I mean, Alex Brand is one of their most prominent members, and he's said things like, quote, Are you gonna suggest deporting the Jews? Yeah, I think we do all the time. Like, I've got that pulled up right here. And he's also spoken about, I've seen him watch footage of people from India being killed gruesomely by a train, and he's sitting there laughing.
Wow.
Like, these are the things they do on their live streams. And but then they also at the same time, they explain their organization, like it's called Diagolon because they made a fake map when Jeremy Mackenzie had like smoked a bunch of weed. Jeremy Mackenzie is sort of the leader and founder of Diagolon. And so he was high and he looked at the places in the United States and Canada that didn't at the time have mask mandates and noticed it sort of created a diagonal line across North America. And he said, we need to make our own
their
country.
Flag?
Exactly. So their flag is sort of this white diagonal line on a black backdrop. And so it's a joke country. And then what's difficult is some reporters came in and they were like, these guys want to make their own country of anti-mask people. And it's like, that part is the joke for them. But what's real is the underlying ideology of anti-science, anti-vaccine, of white supremacy. And, and they would say things like, our vice president will be a cocaine addicted goat named Philip, who's like demonic. And so anytime you call out Diagolon and point out these ideologies they're espousing, you'll end up being laughed at for, falling for the meme. But the reality is that like, while they do these joking sort of these joking ideas of a potential country and engage in that sort of thing, they're actually coalescing a following who are listening to their live streams that run sometimes they're 4 hours long, sometimes even longer. And they do this. There's various influencers in this space who do this several times a week at times. And you can really immerse yourself in this world where they very much have a worldview that they're espousing that is one that is far-right extremism.
And how successful have they been in building that following that you're talking about?
Unfortunately, quite successful. I mean, I don't have a ton to go off of,
Sure.
But the extremism researchers I've spoken to, between monitoring their gatherings, looking at the numbers who tune into their live streams, they also listen to the claims that these guys make about their numbers. Obviously, they tend to be pretty braggadocious, so they might say some numbers that they could be inflating a little bit. But my understanding is that even if they have a lower number of participation, just based on who extremism experts at particularly the Canadian Anti-Hate Network have been able to track, this is the largest white nationalist network in Canada. So it's a big group, and that is very worrying. And I think that there's these soft entry points because of the claims that it's just a meme and that it's a community of, it's especially during COVID, when there was a lot of people who may have been vaccine hesitant without actually being extremists. That was a soft entry point that then led them down this pipeline towards broader extremist sentiment, because they were taken in by this group at a time when they might have been socially ostracized because of the fact that they weren't getting vaccinated. And then these guys, in order to maintain that community, they have to engage in the sort of groupthink that involves these more extreme ideologies. So it's been they've been very powerful and very effective at taking advantage of the grievances and vulnerabilities within our society to radicalize people towards their darker ideologies.
And you mentioned the Freedom Convoy a minute ago. And I guess I'm curious as to if there are links that we can draw between these groups and the Freedom Convoy, what's been called the Freedom Convoy or the trucker movement. So for viewers who don't know, this was in 2022, the movement that basically gridlocked the capital, Ottawa, for weeks. And it was anti-vaccine, it was anti-government, anti-COVID mandate. And really brought the city to a standstill for a period of time. Now, what links can we draw between these groups and the Freedom Convoy? Because you're saying that there are links, aren't there?
Well, the links I wouldn't say are super formal. Like the top leadership, the Freedom Convoy was a sort of, the organization structure was very loose, and they had people that were sort of regional organizers for, where certain trucks were coming from, because they came from all across the country to descend on Ottawa. And, I did some reporting at the time exposing some, one gentleman had photos online of himself in a Soldiers of Odin sweatshirt, which is a extremist group, and another one had videos of himself, mocking Asian folks and doing a heavy accent that was very racist, among other things. And so there were a lot of problematic folks involved, but the Diagolon element, like the main leadership of Diagolon, were mostly just there as attendees, and they took advantage of this event as a means to, they were live streaming through it. They were posting videos. They were getting a following through engaging in sort of this, through making themselves a part of this movement that exposed people to them who may not have otherwise come across them, and, sent them down a pipeline towards radicalization.
So they basically attached themselves to the convoy. In a way.
Yeah. Like they were there on the ground in Ottawa. There's footage of them, the sort of leadership of Diagolon there. And, ahead of it, they were talking about going to Ottawa, and myself and my colleague at the time actually reported that they wanted this to be our January 6th. That's what, in reference to when all of those pro-Trump supporters stormed the Capitol in the United States. So these guys, and the guys who said those words were top guys with Diagolon, and they said it on one of their live streams. So, they were certainly there. They were supportive of it. They didn't necessarily have like a leadership role or an organizational role, but the fact that they were posting through it and used that sort of language to further build their following, I think helped contribute to certain individuals finding a soft entry point to these more radical ideologies.
And let's break it down now. So you were saying, I mentioned Diagolon, I mentioned Second Sons and Dominion. You're saying they're kind of all linked up or part of the same group. And my understanding is Diagolon is more the content creators or the streamers we just talked about. And then there's Second Sons, which is labeled as a militant wing. And then there's Dominion, which is called a political wing. So I want to hear a more detailed breakdown from your angle about this.
Yeah, so the Canadian Anti-Hate Network is a great resource on a lot of this stuff, and they actually published a piece breaking this down and breaking down the ties between them. But effectively, as we just explained, Diagolon really is a sort of propaganda arm where they post memes, they do the live streams, they do a lot of irony poisoning and just like pretending that it's all a joke when in fact it's actually very real. And so people can joke their way into becoming radicalized where they don't realize they're internalizing the things that they're joking about as they do so. But then an interesting thing happened while I was monitoring Diagolon over the last few years. They did this thing they called the Rage Tour, and they I might be getting that name wrong, but it was like the Road Rage Tour or something like that. But they went on tour across the country and held events where they spoke to the public, to anyone who paid to see them at these events. And I got my hands on leaked audio of one of these events after an activist had infiltrated one of these weird little tour things they went on, where they did a mix of shitty comedy and very real and scary, hateful espousing of ideas. And one of the things that stood out to me was Derek Harrison, who's one of the there's sort of three guys at the top of Diagolon: Derek Harrison, Jeremy McKenzie, who's really the leader, and Alex Friend. Those are sort of the big three guys. And then there's Jeremy's girlfriend, Morgan May. And Derek Harrison, in this leaked audio, was saying that, at first it was all a joke. We were just kind of messing around. But then we had politicians. Trudeau said our name in the House of Commons. But in the audio I obtained, they admit it themselves on stage. Listen to this.
This all started as a joke, making YouTube videos, but then we got noticed, right? The Prime Minister had said our name in the House of Commons multiple times. So we realized that we can move the needle in politics in Canada. So we decided to take it a little bit more seriously. As you can tell, this isn't my style.
Because he highlighted Diagolon as a group that was concerning in the House of Commons. And he said, Derek Harrison, that's when we realized we should take this a little more seriously because we can really move the needle. And that was sort of the shift that I've observed, where now they have taken what was originally this shitty live stream, group that would just espouse these awful ideas, but generally kept that to the online world, aside from a few like little in-person meetups from fans and, the guys who know each other. They took that and they have brought it offline and created this organization called Second Sons, which is an active club. It is a group of guys who are doing military-style drills and practicing fighting with the underlying ideology of, opposing immigration. It really is just like quite...
And these active clubs, there's I guess multiple active clubs, because there's Nationalist 13, right? NS 13. There's it's not just one active club across Canada, from my understanding.
Yeah. So basically, the Second Sons have chapters. It's hard to say whether those chapters are just like one guy in certain towns or if there's a couple, but you can see, like, I monitor their Telegram chats, and this is a social media app where a lot of it's very loosely moderated, to put it lightly. So a lot of these guys coalesce there and can say things that they can't say on other social media. And they post pictures of their meetups, their training, at gyms. And, they have outwardly said, Alex Friend, that they're inspired by groups like the United States white supremacist group Patriot Front. They've gone on the record and said that they're inspired by Patriot Front. And that's really concerning, because they are training offline seemingly to engage in violence because of the fact that what they're training in is fighting and military style drills. And yes, there are chapters across the country. And another thing that's fascinating, that goes back to my original point about how this is really Diagolon and its, associates are absorbing the white nationalist and extremist, far-right extremist movement in Canada. There are other active clubs that were pre-existing like the Frontenac Active Club, that have been absorbed by Diagolon. And they actually like formally announced that now this group is a Second Sons Active Club, or part of their group. And these guys have uniforms. They've started trying to intimidate people with these public demonstrations where they all wear black and mask their faces.
And that's a key thing, Rachel, right? Because they have held public rallies.
Yes, absolutely. Like they have gone to, in the Niagara region, they held a demonstration around the statue of Isaac Brock. They went to a CBC, Canada's national, public broadcaster location in Ottawa, which is also a block away from our parliament buildings. And they were standing directly in front of some parliamentary buildings where MPs do their work. And they were holding a sign that said CBC hates white people. And, just railing on, standing there. Like Jeremy Mackenzie gave some big speech. And, there was also a demonstration that same day in Regina, Saskatchewan. And, these guys are all in their uniforms, very Patriot Front style aesthetics to their uniforms as well. You can see the inspiration there. And, the banner is also very similar to the kinds of banners that the Australian neo-Nazi group, the NSN, tends to hold and walk around with. So there's a lot of cross-pollination and inspiration there. I mean, Alex Friend has interviewed Thomas Sewell, who's a very prominent Australian neo-Nazi, on his live streams. And, it's just like they say the N-word nonstop and just say all kinds of stuff. But yes, it was in person, and it was concerning to me just that they have this level of organization, because when you combine that with the sort of hateful ideology they espouse, I'm very concerned about, first of all, one of their members taking it upon themselves to act on what Jeremy Mackenzie, for example, says all the time in his live streams, which is that someone has to do something about this. This world is, there's so much wrong with the world. Someone has to do something. But also the fact that they are... that something could happen in a more organized way. And it doesn't necessarily have to be anything as formal as an attack. I'm not saying that they're plotting anything along those lines, but, groups like the Proud Boys would go and they would antagonize what they would call Antifa or any progressive protesters and get in these street brawls. So I am concerned that we might see an escalation in violence because these guys are training themselves for it. And what is the end goal of that, if not to act on the violence that they're training themselves for?
And ultimately, what is it that they want? Like, I looked at some of the stuff that Dominion has put up.
Yeah.
And it's, I guess the big picture stuff is that they want to establish mass deportation, and they want to basically get rid of the permanent residency status in Canada, right? And they also, which I found interesting, they wanted to set up a voluntary, I guess, renunciation of your Canadian citizenship if you're a descendant of immigrants. So it's obviously all related to immigration, most of it at least. There's also xenophobia, there's Islamophobia, there's anti-Semitism. But again, from where you are, what's the overarching thing that these groups want at the end of the day?
Yeah, I mean, it's white in nature. It is the dominance of white people. And they believe that Canada is a country that belongs to white people, which is ironic, or not, maybe that's not the right term for it, but it's ludicrous when you think about the fact that white people haven't even been here that long and that we are only here because of colonialism. But yeah, they basically don't want people of color in this country.
Here's something that I'm curious to get your thoughts on, because 10 years ago in Canada, we wouldn't have had these groups talking publicly the way they are, would we?
I don't think so. I mean, no, I don't think so. I think they would have been shouted down, but there's a really mainstream or there's sort of a mainstreamification of racism, particularly towards the South Asian community in Canada, that we're seeing really escalate. And yeah, I think that it's kind of an indictment of Canadian society that these guys' ideas are not immediately shouted down. I mean, they are in some ways. One thing that made me laugh really hard was when the Diagolon Second Sons guys were doing their demonstration outside of CBC, a man walked by and said, "Bunch of fucking losers." And everyone was like, "See, this guy's Canada. This is our guy." And, and there was still like a lot of support for that guy. But the fact that these guys aren't afraid and don't feel, they complain a lot about being persecuted in society, and they have faced a very low level degree of consequences for some of the things that they've done. I mean,
that would have
Jeremy
been my
Mackenzie,
follow-up. Yeah.
Yeah, it's not much at all. Actually, you know what? I don't know if I would even say they've really faced consequences, because they haven't, to my knowledge, been charged for any of the language that they've used, the incitement to hate. I haven't seen anything along those lines. The only engagement with the legal system that they've had is Jeremy Mackenzie was charged with some weapons charges, I believe, and he overcame those. He didn't end up being found guilty. So to date, there really hasn't been a degree of justice. I mean, my understanding, I've seen some of them post about being denied financial services, being debanked, which is obviously like banks can refuse service to people if they worry about how the funds are going to be used and things like that. But, I'm just going based off of their posts, so I don't know the degree to which these consequences are real, or, how widespread they are, whether it's just one bank or several. And, it tends to be, if you're denied one, they'll sort of deny you across the board. But, it's hard to say how significant these consequences are. And I think that clearly the consequences they've faced have not been significant enough to deter them. And if anything, it contributes to their persecution complex that drives a lot of their victim narrative that fuels, like, they think that white people are under attack, and they think that they are under attack for defending white people. And so a lot of this also fuels that perceived victimhood.
Yeah. And you're referring to how it's spilling into the mainstream. And I think this is a really important topic to unpack. Because there is also data to kind of show that anti-immigrant sentiment in Canada is rising. I mean, in 2019, Canada was named through a poll as the most accepting country for immigrants. And I think it's safe to say that that's no longer the case. I mean, there was a recent poll that showed nearly 60% of Canadians think that the country has too many immigrants, or nearly 60%. And then more than a third agree that immigrants increase the level of crime in Canada, and that the country accepts too many from racial minority groups. So it is spilling. It is spilling into public opinion. And I'm wondering if there is a correlation between the kind of support that these groups are getting and the anger that people are facing in the street, because that's something that some politicians are also tapping into, right? The anti-immigrant sentiment, and they're using the fact that I guess the woes the working class in Canada is seeing when it comes to the housing crisis, when it comes to the cost of living and the inflation, and kind of just using the immigrant blame game as a way to kind of tap into that anger. I think of Maxime Bernier, for example, who's the head of the People's Party, who spoke about immigration and immigrants representing a threat to the way of Canadian life. And someone more mainstream is Pierre Poilievre, the head of the Conservative Party, who's also criticized the immigration system in Canada. And he said something along the lines of, we need more people leaving than ones coming in. So I am curious to hear on how this rhetoric from the far right is kind of coming into mainstream politicians and their rhetoric and public opinion.
Yeah, I mean, I think that these guys are exacerbating narratives that paint immigrants as either dangerous or taking something from Canadians that they're for some reason owed, or, like they blame immigrants for, as you said, the housing crisis. And frankly, the Liberals have even contributed to that. I mean, they've said things like, we have immigration as a cause of the strain on our housing market, which I think is unhelpful to highlight, particularly when there's such a confluence of factors. But it's certainly groups like this. They go out of their way to anytime there's a crime that is committed by a racialized person or by an immigrant, they will blow it up and make it their sort of pet cause for an extended period of time to suggest that these people are dangerous, to suggest that immigrants or racialized people are violent, or, and to confirm those biases that, people may or may not already have. And I do think that a major part in why this spills over to the mainstream is also the sort of alt media ecosystem. And these guys sort of have one foot in the extremism world and one foot in the mainstream. And to give you an example, Juno News, which Pierre Poilievre has sat down for one-on-one interviews with, before he was willing to do those, he had sort of his party was boycotting mainstream media at the time. And he sat down for these one-on-ones with Juno News and did interviews with them. And Juno News published an op-ed from Daniel Tyree, the founder of the Dominion Society, explaining what remigration is, which is something that, while he denies its association with ethnic cleansing, has been characterized by experts as a form of ethnic cleansing of a society, because it is pushing out basically anyone who isn't white. That is effectively, any immigrants, but it has this emphasis on racialized immigrants. And Juno News published this guy's op-ed, and they put a little disclaimer saying this doesn't necessarily represent the views of Juno News. But the fact that they are willing to give this guy a platform when they have one of the top substacks in world politics is really concerning. And, that sort of thing normalizes rhetoric that would otherwise be relegated to the fringes of our society. Then you have Pierre Poilievre visiting a Freedom Convoy style encampment there was a trailer, and he went into this trailer and got a tour. And as he's walking out, you can see that there's a little Diagolon flag on the side of the trailer. And while a lot of people brushed it off saying, oh, come on, just because it's on the side of the trailer doesn't mean anything. A lot of people had signed the side of this trailer. I dug into it and found that these individuals actually had ties to Jeremy Mackenzie and to Diagolon that go well beyond just the simple flag. They had, Facebook pictures with them. They had worn merch from Diagolon. And so, when you're not, frankly, first and foremost, I think it's actually dangerous for politicians to be putting themselves in situations without fully vetting the people that they're dealing with, assuming they haven't. And if they have, then what are they endorsing and what are they normalizing when they engage in this way and normalize the kind of rhetoric that these individuals are espousing? There's a variety of ways in which these guys are out there constantly just fueling propaganda that is anti-immigrant and that is racist. And they are going to continue to do that. That is their whole thing. But when you also have politicians who are contributing to that normalization, when you have media who are also contributing to that normalization, many columnists would also mock when I would report on this and say, oh, Diagolon's just a meme. To this day, there was someone posting that today, like saying, oh my God, she's talking about Diagolon again. And it's just like, yes, this is a huge threat. This is a huge, it's really scary and dangerous for racialized people in this country.
That's exactly the discrepancy that I want to get into. But before I ask you about how this, have you been dealing with this on a personal level? We're talking about the NGO, the Canada Anti-Hate Network, and how they're sounding the alarm over this and saying that this movement is actually, more dangerous and more threatening than it's ever been in Canada. And yet, where is traditional or legacy media when it comes to the coverage of this? Because look, I'll be honest with you. I've seen coverage by the CBC and I've seen coverage by other outlets, but I guess it wouldn't match the how the NGO is framing it, right? When you see the coverage, it wouldn't match the gravity of how much, or the weight of how much this NGO is saying that how much of a threat this is. It's like there's coverage, but it's not as wide or it's not as big as you'd expect or deep as you expect it to be. But what do you think?
I mean, it's frustrating. I'm glad that CBC finally started covering this, but even when I was in mainstream media and I was trying to get stories published on Diagolon, I had to fight really hard to get those stories published at times.
Why did you have to fight hard?
I honestly, it's hard to say because I saw the inherent newsworthiness of this. But the more I interrogate that question, because it's one I wrestle with, the more I don't like the answers that I come to. And I think an overarching criticism I have of Canadian media is I think that we have what I would characterize as a normalcy bias, where they're still in that mindset of that world 10 years ago, where these guys would.
This is the alt-right, right? This is the alt-right. Yeah, we're still in alt-right.
Exactly. Era. Yeah. And that these guys are fringe and that it's not something that's permeating society. It's not something that's becoming increasingly normalized. It's not something our politicians and alt media are helping to normalize, and I think that bias and misconception then colors what stories they think are newsworthy, because if they think that these guys are super fringe, they still have this idea that reporting on them is just platforming them and makes their ideas mainstream, as if they aren't already doing that, as if there isn't this sort of companion internet that exists where these guys have Telegram as an alternate social media. There's Rumble, which is like an alternate YouTube where that is much more lightly moderated. There's Twitter, which is barely moderated at this point, although these guys do sometimes still manage to get a ban, which is frankly impressive levels of hate at this point, because it's pretty hard to get banned from Twitter these days. But if you act as though these guys are fringe and covering them would normalize them or amplify them, obviously it's still a question you have to grapple with. You want to make sure that you're reporting on them responsibly in order to not expose more people to these groups and radicalize more people. But to not cover them at all is just living in the past. And I think that was sort of the mindset that they were in, is this mindset of living in the past. But when it comes to CBC's reporting nowadays, for example, they are starting to do some good work, and they're actually working with the help of the Canadian Anti-Hate Network a lot of the time. But it almost seems like they're more excited sometimes to have a scoop than to actually be reporting responsibly and I don't know. I mean, they don't do a terrible job. They're CBC's had some good investigations, but I think that a lot of media is so far behind in understanding these guys and how they work that they end up reporting in slightly irresponsible ways at times, or making big mistakes, or characterizing them in ways that isn't necessarily helpful. But I do think that they're headed in a better direction, and they are getting better with it. I'm a little salty sometimes, which I have to catch myself with, because of the fact that I, was mocked for so long for covering these things. And now I see CBC literally.
You still are in a way, aren't you, Rachel? I see it online.
Yeah.
I don't think the mocking has stopped. But let's actually talk about that, because this is a story you've been covering for a few years now, right? And I want to ask you about the personal cost of this. What have you been subjected to for reporting on the story in Canada?
It's been awful, honestly. And it's it's changed how I live my life, truly.
Really?
And it's too bad because I don't know. I don't know how to say this. Sometimes when I talk about this, I just feel like I sound so savory, and I don't want to come across that way. But I genuinely did go into journalism because I wanted to help people. I saw it as a tool to help people. And so when I heard about these groups and when I learned what they were doing, I wasn't thinking about how they would respond to me. I was just thinking about reporting on them and exposing what they're doing so that people can be safe and people can feel protected and feel like someone cares that this is happening. Because if you're a member of a racialized group and there's these guys out there who want you and your loved ones to be deported or laugh at people who look like you being killed by trains. I would hate for someone to think that society, and unfortunately, it wouldn't be unreasonable for them to feel this way, but that society and institutions don't care. And so I wanted to try to push back against that by covering this stuff and exposing it when I was with mainstream media. And I didn't really stop to think about how they would focus on me. And I think that part of the reason why they initially kind of came after me was that I did my reporting also via TikTok for Global News. And so they had video footage in short form, easily digestible videos where I was talking about them. And so they started using my clips for their content. And I think if I had just been writing articles, they wouldn't have gotten the same mileage out of it. And so that kind of created the beginning of a fixation that they had on me. And maybe I like to...
How far did it go?
Yeah, I mean, they... when they were on their tour, they posted on their Telegram that they had a printout of my face on a donation bucket or something where people could throw things at it. One of the Diagolon members I mentioned earlier, Derek Harrison, printed my face on a pillow and, posted a video of his dog humping it. They've also made really threatening remarks. Like Jeremy McKenzie said, if he saw me getting gang raped by Indian migrants in the streets, he would just laugh and say nature's a playground. The one of the more harrowing incidents was when I was living in Ottawa, I was walking down the street on a day off and I walked by a construction site, and one of the gentlemen who was like working construction stopped me and he was like, "Hey, are you Rachel Gilmore?" And I was like, "Yeah, I am." And we actually had a pleasant interaction. Like I shook his hand and he was like, "Yeah, I think I know you from TikTok." And I was like, "Oh, I hope you like it." Because I knew that there's some people who really don't like my work and some people who really do. And so I was like, "I hope you like it." And he was like, yeah. And I was like, "Okay, I'm not convinced that you're necessarily a fan, but we had a nice interaction and you don't have to be a fan." So I shook his hand and walked away. And then not long afterwards, I walked by the Ottawa courthouse just around the corner where a Freedom Convoy trial was happening. So there were all of these sort of convoy types out front. And I saw one of the guys out front filming me. And so after I walked away, I checked my phone to see, hey, did the guy out front of the courthouse post a video of me? That's awkward. I just want to see what's going on there. And I saw that I actually had a message from an extremism researcher I know warning me not about the guy who filmed me around the courthouse, but back when I talked to those construction workers, one of them had taken a photo of me as I walked away, posted it to a Diagolon forum saying exactly where I was walking. And, they could see what I was wearing. They said the intersection I was headed towards, they were all calling me like saying I was going to work the corner and stuff, just like offensive stuff. But what I found really concerning was that they had posted my live location while I was walking around alone. And so I was luckily close to the mall, and I just went into the mall and I awkwardly told mall security, "Hey, this is happening. Do you think I could hang around you for a minute just in case anyone shows up?" And they were very confused by it and didn't seem overly concerned. So I ended up going into a store and buying a toque and a hoodie so that I could change what I was wearing based on the photo that they had put online, and walk the rest of the way home without being concerned that someone could spot me and spot where I live.
How do you walk out publicly after this? I mean, I feel like that's traumatic enough.
Yeah, with a lot of paranoia. And it's hard because, I'm a 6 foot tall redhead. So, I'm not exactly someone who blends in the first
hard
place.
To miss
so
you.
Yeah. And another aspect of this is while I was getting all these threats, the Diagolon guys one of them made a video about me that kept showing the jigsaw from the movie Saw and making whip sounds, saying, you know what we do to horses when they don't behave. He pulled out a knife at one point. He was making a reference to Jagmeet Singh and his religious blade that he carries. But it was, in the context of the video, felt quite menacing. And there was something that looked like a gun on the table. I reported it to the Ottawa police, but they told me it wasn't a threat under the criminal code.
Really? So the police wasn't involved?
No. And so really, I felt like I had to fend for myself, which was why I became very outspoken about it, because I was like, well, if the police aren't going to protect me, my newsroom, I know they were really concerned, particularly my direct boss really cared personally. But their response was also to try to tell me to shut down my accounts or to post way less on social media. And I was like, well, this is my career, though, and this is what they want. So if your response every time a woman, or alternatively, these guys tend to go after racialized people, is to tell them to shut down their social medias, you're kind of just doing what these guys want you to do. They want fewer women in media. They want fewer, so I found all of that frustrating. But a moment that really struck me was I got a knock at my apartment door, when all of this was going on at its height, I guess I would say, although it's still simmering constantly.
Right.
I got a knock at my apartment door, and it was CSIS, which is Canada's spy agency. Yep. And they, they came in and they talked to me about the threats, talked to me about Diagolon. And one of them, I don't know if it was a joke, but it was kind of one of those like half jokes where, it wouldn't be a bad idea, but maybe this is a ridiculous suggested that I should wear a wig and colored contacts when I go out.
Really?
So that these guys wouldn't recognize me. Yeah. And so there was just this constant feeling of paranoia, and what that ended up resulting in, and it's hard to say because I also turned, I'm in my 30s now. So maybe some of this would have happened anyway, but I really stopped going out as much. I used to go out dancing with my friends or have a few drinks, and now I rarely have more than 2 drinks. And admittedly, maybe some of that's because of the hangover. That's a lot worse now. But this has been going on for years. And even when I was still in my 20s, I didn't want to get drunk because I was concerned that if I ever had a few too many drinks in public, that if one of these guys showed up, I wouldn't be safe. And I wouldn't be able to be alert. I would be really paranoid. It's less so now. But if I was out, I would always want to kind of have my wits about me, be able to see the room, be able to know where my exits are and things like that. It was really bad. And, one time someone traveled from Toronto to Montreal after I moved here and came to a small bar where my partner was playing a small local show and filmed me the whole time I was sitting there watching my partner on this private night out. And then when I left, sort of ambushed me claiming to be like a citizen journalist. And this is a person who has gone on Diagolon live streams, who, when they posted the footage of me and my partner on this private night out, Diagolon folks, including Jeremy McKenzie, the leader, were in the replies, talking about it. And so they're seeing these people sharing a place where I spent my time, so I'm never going back to that bar. Luckily, the bar closed down anyway, but,
Right.
Yeah.
But these instances aren't just related to the time when you were working for mainstream media in Canada. I mean, it's continued to happen as you became an independent journalist as well. I mean, I'm thinking also one of the things that got you in the headlines a little bit was after the Charlie Kirk killing. Right. And there was a website that's now defunct, but I guess it was a website that was called Charlie Kirk's Murderers or something along those lines.
Expose Charlie's murderers. Yeah.
Yes. Yeah. Exposing Charlie's murderers. And your name was on that website. And to make it
the first
worse,
entry.
Yeah. which is crazy. But to make it even worse, you had conservative politicians like Andrew Scheer kind of amplify that messaging by tweeting about how much hate you had in you or something along those lines.
Yeah.
But yeah, like that hasn't stopped basically.
Yeah. In that instance, like I from a career basically at this point. Like, it's been years of reporting on the far right, informed my analysis after Charlie Kirk was killed, because obviously, like, at my desk, I saw the video and I wish I could unsee it. It was horrible. But he had some awful followers and awful fans because he said some really disgusting, hateful, just like shouldn't be socially acceptable things. And so what I said was, I'm terrified to think how some of his followers who are already aching for violence might use this as an opportunity and an excuse to retaliate against their perceived political enemies, regardless of who actually killed Charlie Kirk. That was all I said. And they put me on a website claiming I was celebrating Charlie Kirk's murder. And Andrew Scheer amplified, he took my post and he framed it in the context of saying, hey, look how twisted she is. How sick and full of hate do you have to be to, post something like that? And that was what caused the first wave, like he was the first one really to come after me like that. Obviously, there's always some bad faith guys who try to get clicks off my name and, come in whenever they think they could have a gotcha.
And it's not just people on the far right. It's people that also, I guess, would label themselves as right wing, not necessarily far right.
Yes,
but it's also
exactly.
people that would call themselves right wing.
I mean, Andrew Scheer is a mainstream conservative politician, former leader of the Conservative Party, and really like a right-hand man to Pierre Poilievre at this point, sitting MP. And he's saying those things and everyone is just piling on and he's doing nothing to stop it. And as this continued to circulate, that's when I got a message from an acquaintance who said, hey, I just thought you might want to know you're on this website. And I clicked the link and I thought she sent me a posting of my entry, like maybe they had an individual page for each person that had been submitted. But I realized that it was the homepage and my name was first. And things just exploded after that. And I honestly do wonder if Andrew Scheer hadn't amplified my post and framed it in that bad light, if I would have ended up on that website in the same way and dealing with what I had dealt with. And that's sort of the ways in which I think conservative politicians who remove all context from the things they say and do within a very real context of the rise of the far right in this country, when they ignore that context and think that they can just put the target on the back of a journalist who is already heavily targeted by these folks, like they're just showing a reckless disregard of the impact that their actions have in a real world that has context and that doesn't exist in a vacuum.
So how do you navigate it, Rachel, though? How do you navigate something like that? Like, how do you continue following this beat, reporting on this story, at the same time doing it safely as well?
I sometimes think my brain's a little broken because It's like, maybe I should stop at some point. But do you know what I think about is I come back to that. And again, I feel like I sound so like I'm trying to be some savior or something, but I really do come back to that guiding principle that is the whole reason I feel like I'm even on this earth, like why what I endeavor my contribution to be when I leave this earth is that hopefully I will have helped some vulnerable people to feel like they're protected and worth being protected. And I just, when these guys hit back at me so hard, I actually weirdly get fueled by it in a way because it tells me that what I'm doing is effective. I don't think they would try this hard to discredit me and take me down and, smear my reputation so that I'm not taken seriously if the things that I was saying about what they're doing weren't working, weren't, exposing them, weren't, taking some of the wind out of their radicalization sails. And and the reason that a lot of people in the Conservative Party don't seem to like me is I call it out when I see the Conservative MPs dog whistling these politics, which they might do for political points. And I've definitely seen them, sort of engage in, they'll use rhetoric or, like Pierre Poilievre was using words like the Great Reset, for example, which is like a conspiracy that a lot of these guys believe in. And I make those linkages. And I think that a lot of people want to be able to have their cake and eat it too. They want to be able to claim that they're not involved in these dark, they want to be able to claim that they're not trying to win the votes of people involved in these dark spaces while also getting those votes. And I think that that is not something that we should allow to be acceptable, because the ramifications of that is that they end up normalizing those politics. And so it's hard. It's hard to live like this. It's hard to, I have to tell friends when they come over not to take pictures. Like, if I see someone get out of camera, I'm like, make sure there's no window in the picture if you're going to post
so
that on social media.
Where you live. Yeah, of course.
Yeah. Or, even if we're out together, don't put that on your story right now, because if you do, people might know where I am and they might show up. So there's a lot of ways in which it's affected my life. And, I always live with the fear that if someone does find out where I live, I might have to pack up and move,
Wow.
And I worry about my family. They've come after my family. Even my sister's husband was streaming on Twitch once, and someone came into the chat talking about me. And so it's the degrees of harassment and the way it reverberates through my life. I have a lot of guilt about my family, but luckily they're kind of brain broken in the same way as me. And they're like, no, go get them. but it is hard. It's not a pleasant thing. But what also isn't pleasant is having to live in a world where there's white supremacists advocating for the mass deportation of people who don't look like me. And so I think that as someone who looks like me, it's my responsibility to push back against that.
And let's end it on this one. My last question before I let you go, Rachel. I guess, what do you want people's takeaway to be? What do you want people to be looking at from everything we just kind of discussed?
I want them to know that white supremacy is a massive issue in Canada. It is not just an American thing. It is not just a European thing. It is something that we develop, nurture, and grow here in Canada. And so you need to be alert to it, watch for warning signs that people in your life are being radicalized, and push back against it. Take it seriously enough to stick up for the people in your life who would be impacted by it. We have to care. And I think as long as people just buy into this idea that we're not like that, they end up passively falling into a world where that becomes our reality.
And on that note, Rachel Gilmore, thank you so much for coming on Real Talk. I appreciate you coming on. I appreciate you, putting a spotlight on the story. There's a lot that we unpacked there, but thanks for doing that with me.
Thank you so much for having me. This is a great conversation.
Thank you, Rachel.